First of all, I want to welcome everyone for joining us. My name is Joel Bond. I am the Associate Director for Alums for Campus Fairness. And we mobilize alumni to combat anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias on campuses across the country. And we're so excited to have you with us for another edition. And today we are being joined by Alyza D. Lewin. Now, Alyza D. Lewin is the president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, a nonprofit organization established to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promote justice for all. The Brandeis Center conducts research, education, and legal advocacy to combat the resurgence of anti-Semitism on college and university campuses. It empowers students by training them to understand their legal rights and educates administrators on best practices to combat racism and anti-Semitism on campus. Ms. Lewin is a co-founder and partner at Lewin & Lewin LLP, where she specializes in litigation, mediation, and government relations. Ms. Lewin has represented numerous high-profile clients. In 2014, Lewin argued Zivotofsky, if I got that right, versus Kerry.
Zivotofsky. It's a mouthful.
Versus Kerry, the Jerusalem passport case before the U.S. Supreme Court, a case involving the constitutionality of a law granting any American citizen born in Jerusalem the right to list Israel as the place of birth on his or her U.S. passport. In Zivotofsky, the Supreme Court held the President of the United States has exclusive authority to recognize foreign sovereigns. The case paved the way for President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and the recognition of Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. After 18 years, Ms. Lewin brought this pro bono case to a successful resolution in October 2020, when Secretary of State Pompeo revised the U.S. passport regulations and Ambassador David Friedman presented her case with the very first U.S. passport to list Israel as a place of birth for a U.S. citizen born in Jerusalem. Ms. Lewin, together with her father, Nathan Lewin, also successfully represented the Boeing family in its landmark civil tort litigation, which established the right of American victims of terror to obtain damages under American law against organizations that knowingly provide financial support to international terrorist organizations.
So thank you very much for that introduction. And as you described, I'm now president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. And in that capacity, I hear almost every day from students who are experiencing anti-Semitism on campus. Very often, these students are being told either sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, that if they want to be accepted on campus, if they want to be included, for example, in the social or racial justice movements, if they want to join progressive clubs, or even sometimes just engage in dialogue, they're basically told that they first have to shed their sense of Jewish peoplehood, abandon their ethnic pride, and disavow the Jews' ancestral indigenous connection to the land of Israel. As you and I know and have heard from students, right, when they express their support for Israel as the Jewish homeland, they're often stigmatized, marginalized, and excluded. And that is, as a lawyer, I can tell you, anti-Semitic harassment and discrimination. And so the real question is, and one of the things that we'll be discussing today is, why is that permitted? Why isn't there more of an outcry and universal condemnation of what's happening on campus? And I think that there are a couple of main reasons for that. One is that even though anti-Semitism is society's oldest hatred, it's probably one of our most misunderstood hatreds. I think that many people don't really understand what anti-Semitism is. Those who think they understand it, what they recognize as anti-Semitism is the anti-Semitism that resembles the Holocaust. And in many ways, that's understandable because the Holocaust clearly has been it's probably undoubtedly been the most defining moment in recent history in terms of anti-Semitism. And so if people see a swastika, or if they hear a white supremacist or a Nazi, they recognize that that is anti-Semitism. Or if they realize that somebody who is very identifiably Jewish, perhaps because of the way they dress, is targeted and physically attacked, then they'll say, okay, that is anti-Semitic. Like when you had in Muncie more than a year ago, Hanukkah time, the machete attack, where very visibly identifiable Jews were attacked. Or if somebody goes into a synagogue when Jews are praying and opens fire, like at the Tree of Life synagogue or in the Chabad of Poway, people will recognize that as anti-Semitic. But beyond that, many people don't understand or don't recognize anti-Semitism. And the truth is, anti-Semitism looks a little different in every generation. It morphs. The one constant about anti-Semitism, however, is that anti-Semitism always takes whatever is that generation's greatest evil, whatever that society views as its misfortune, and it pins it on the Jew. The Jew becomes the scapegoat. The Jew is viewed as the reason for that misfortune. And so, throughout history, you could see at one point Jews were the Christ killer, or for socialists, the Jews were the capitalists, or for capitalists, the Jews were the socialists. During the Black Death, the Jews were blamed for the bubonic plague. The Nazis, which sought a pure Aryan race, viewed the Jews as the ultimate race polluters. If you think about our generation today, if you think about society today, what is the issue that has led to demonstrations, massive upheaval, certainly in our country, even riots? It's the issue of racism, apartheid, or settler colonialism, right? It's interesting that many today view not only the Jews, your individual Jews, as responsible for these greatest ills, but the one thing that is new, right, since the time of the Holocaust, is that we actually now have not just individual Jews, but we have a Jewish collective. We have a Jewish nation state, a Jewish homeland, the state of Israel. And many today view that one democracy in the Middle East, that one tiny piece of land where all ethnicities, all religions, all genders are all equal under the law, that democracy, the Jewish homeland, is branded as the worst offender when it comes to society's greatest evil. It's the worst offender of racism, allegedly, apartheid, settler colonialism. That is a form of contemporary anti-Semitism, and yet most people don't recognize that as anti-Semitism. Erwin Cutler said it beautifully, and I think he explained it beautifully when he is a former Justice Minister of Canada. He is a former Attorney General of Canada, and he's now is the first one to be appointed as the Canadian Special Envoy on Holocaust issues and to combat anti-Semitism. And he has explained that if traditional anti-Semitism sought to marginalize and exclude individual Jews, right, that was the idea of the Yellow Star of David. You branded the Jew as somebody who had to be on the outside, right? You couldn't do business with the individual Jew. You couldn't engage with them, purchase from their stores or use them as your professionals, for your lawyers or your doctors. They had to be kept out. So that was traditional anti-Semitism, to deny individual Jews their place in society. Today's contemporary form of anti-Semitism is seeking to do the same thing to the Jewish collective, to the state of Israel. It's seeking to deny the Jewish nation its place in the society of nations. It's saying, you of all the nations in the world are the only one that has no right to exist. You must be excluded. You have no right. You must be kept out. That's what today's contemporary anti-Semitism is. So that's one of the big problems that we face, is that people don't understand anti-Semitism. Another one, which we can get into as we talk further, is that people don't understand what Zionism is. And that presents another difficulty. But I know you have some questions to ask, and so we can go through some of these questions and I can explain some more as we go along.
Thank you so much, Alyza. That was a great introduction. And I think we're going to start off following in the footsteps of the conversation about anti-Semitism. Obviously, broadly, anti-Semitism is seen by many as the greatest threat broadly facing Jewish and Zionist students. But what do you see specifically as the greatest threat facing Jewish and Zionist students on campus right now?
So one is, as I explained, that people don't understand what anti-Semitism is. The second is that people don't understand Zionism, and so therefore they mistakenly think that what is happening on campus and what they're witnessing is just a political disagreement, right? Administrators on campus think that what they're seeing is a debate, essentially. One side has its opinion, the other side has their opinion. They think this is all a matter of speech, and because of our First Amendment protections in this country, they say, there's nothing we can do. We're not about to get involved. But that's not what's happening on campus. What's happening on campuses today is part of a very deliberate, strategic campaign to marginalize and exclude pro-Israel students and insist that they have to shed a key component of their identity as Jews in order to be welcome on campus. So what do I mean by that? If we understand Judaism, it's not just, right, Judaism is not just a religion. Jews share not only a religious faith, but they also share this sense of Jewish peoplehood and a deep historic connection to the land of Israel. In fact, many people don't realize that over half of the 613 commandments in the Pentateuch actually relate to the land of Israel and can only be fulfilled in the land of Israel. That's how deep and how integral the Jews' connection to the land of Israel is. For centuries, the Jews have prayed not only facing Jerusalem, they've prayed to return to Jerusalem, right? This whole deep connection of the Jews to this land and the belief that Jews will once again return to this land and exercise their right to self-determination there and reestablish their Jewish homeland there, that's not something that was created in the 1800s. That's something that is as old as Judaism itself. It dates back to biblical times, to Abraham, to Moses, to the exodus of the Jews and the return from the Jews, the exodus from Egypt and the return to the promised land. So when Jewish students on campus are being told, well, you're welcome to join our efforts to demonstrate on behalf of women's rights, LGBT rights, immigration rights, climate change, right? Any of these issues. But first, what you have to do is shed your support for Israel. That is asking many of these Jews to shed their ethnic pride, to shed their sense of Jewish peoplehood, to shed this part of their identity that's been a key part of their Judaism, as much a part of their Judaism, I would suggest, as observing Shabbat or keeping kosher. Right? And if you say, well, how could you, I've had people say, how could you say that, Alyza? How could you say that Zionism is as integral to Judaism as observing Shabbat or keeping kosher when there are Jews who say Zionism is not a part of my Jewish identity? And I say, you know how many Jews there are who don't observe Shabbat or don't keep a kosher diet? That doesn't mean, right, that for those who do observe Shabbat, that this is not an integral part for many, many Jews of what it means to be Jewish, right? Those who observe Shabbat in any way, shape, or form, and it's a very wide spectrum of what that means to incorporate some kind of Shabbat observance into your life. The reason they do that is as an expression of their Judaism. By the same token, for many, many Jews, expression of support for the idea of a Jewish homeland comes from a place of ethnic pride, a support in the idea of the Jewish people, pride in what the Jewish people have done, a sense that the Jews have a right to a Jewish homeland. It has nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. Right? You can have Jews on campus who might say, I am glad that there is a Jewish homeland, that there's one place in the world where the Jewish calendar is the national calendar, right? Where I don't have to worry about taking time off, taking all my vacation days to observe the Jewish holidays or getting an exam on Yom Kippur. I know that kosher food will always be available. I think it's cool that there's a place where the ancient Jewish language of Hebrew is the spoken language. It's amazing. I love the Jewish culture, the Jewish food, the Jewish music. I think it's amazing that Jews can live in a place where they can walk on the same stones that Jews walked on 3,000 years ago. If Jews express that kind of pride, if they are proud of what the modern state of Israel has done in terms of high tech or medicine contributions, right? Math, science, agriculture, you name it, they're immediately demonized and marginalized. But that is demanding that they give up this part of their ethnic identity first. And that's discriminatory. To say you can only join my movement if you give up a part of your identity, that's wrong. Especially today, right? When today's culture is that, an understanding on campuses certainly, is that nobody has a right to define my identity for me. Only I can define my identity for myself, and nobody has a right to define what hostility or discrimination towards my identity is. I should be able to define that for myself as well. Well, the only group that's being told, no, you may not define your own identity for yourself, and you may not define what the discrimination against your identity is, are the Jews. And when everyone is being told that we have to welcome everyone to come to the table with their full identity, with open arms, right? They should feel free and comfortable bringing their full identity to the table. The only group that's being told, no, you have to shed a part of your identity before you come to the table, are the Jews. That's today's anti-Semitism. And one of the biggest challenges that we have facing Jews today is that people don't recognize that yet as anti-Semitism.
In applying the fight against anti-Semitism to campus, looking at the recent Office of Civil Rights OCR report, is the improvement in Title VI response a result of the effect of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and related executive orders? And if so, how is this manifested in helping combat campus anti-Semitism?
So let me explain a little bit of the history in terms of Title VI, because I think that will help people understand how useful and effective it has been. So Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 basically says that any entities that receive government funding may not discriminate on the basis of race, color, or national origin. So pretty much every single university in the United States receives some kind of government funding. There's a very, very small number that don't. And those are primarily a couple of very few religious educational institutions, but overwhelmingly both private and public universities receive some kind of government funding, so they're all covered by Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. But if you notice, when I said that the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act says you can't discriminate on the basis of race, color, or national origin, religion is not included as a protected category. So the question came up years ago, especially after 9/11, as to whether or not religious groups that felt that they were being harassed or discriminated against, whether they are covered by Title VI. And after 9/11, there were religious groups, particularly Muslims, and also Sikhs who were being mistaken as Muslims, who were being subjected to awful harassment and bullying in schools. And they filed complaints, and the question was whether the Department of Justice, which has the authority to review these complaints that are filed, if you file a Title VI complaint, you can either go to court, or if you want to go the administrative route, you file an administrative complaint with the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education. And the question came up whether or not the Office of Civil Rights could even review these complaints. Ken Marcus, who happens to be the founder of the Brandeis Center, this is before he founded the Brandeis Center. In 2004, he was actually serving as the head of the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education. And he said, when he saw this, he said, of course, religious groups are protected under Title VI. He said, when religious groups are being targeted and harassed or discriminated against on the basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity, which is essentially their national origin, right? If they're suffering from national or ethnic origin discrimination, they don't lose the protection that Title VI would give them just because they also share a common faith. So he wrote a Dear Colleague letter back in 2004 where he explained this and basically said that this is the approach of the Department of Education. We believe that Title VI protects members of religious groups when they're being targeted on the basis of their shared ancestral or ethnic characteristics, their shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics. That was in 2004 during the Bush administration. In 2010, during the Obama administration, the Department of Justice adopted this same understanding of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And the Department of Justice actually circulated its own Dear Colleague letter, which reached the same conclusion and actually quoted extensively from Ken Marcus's letter. This is now in 2010. And they agreed that even though Title VI of the Civil Rights Act does not include religion, when religious groups are being targeted on the basis of their actual or perceived shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics, they are covered by Title VI. And in 2010, the Department of Education then wrote a long Dear Colleague letter explaining how educational institutions, when they identify this kind of harassment and discrimination, are required to take prompt and effective steps to end that harassment. So by 2010, you had both. 2010 was during the Obama administration. You had both the Department of Education and the Department of Justice, both Republican administration and Democratic administration, recognizing that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act covers religious groups, members of religious groups, when they're being targeted on the basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity. Now we can move ahead to 2019. In 2019, when President Trump issued his executive order to combat anti-Semitism, that did a couple of things. One is it kicked this up a notch. So now instead of it just being Dear Colleague letters and kind of sub-regulatory guidance that existed in the Department of Education and Department of Justice, explaining that this is their understanding of Title VI, now it elevated it to the level of a presidential executive order and said, this is how we, as the United States executive branch, understand Title VI. We believe that Title VI applies to members of religious groups when they are being targeted on the basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity. That would apply to Jews, to Sikhs, to Muslims, to all religious groups. In addition, it extended it and made it clear that we're not just talking about the Department of Education and the Department of Justice. This, according to the executive order, applies to any executive branch agency that provides money that's covered by Title VI. So if any agency gives money covered by Title VI and you have somebody who alleges that they've been discriminated against and they're a member of a religious group, this understanding of Title VI would apply. If they're being targeted on the basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity, Title VI applies. That's the first thing it did. It brought that recognition up a notch and made sure that it applies across the board to all executive branch agencies that utilize Title VI. The second thing it did is it linked the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition to Title VI. And it said, okay, now that you realize that you have to investigate these allegations of discrimination, what does national origin discrimination against Jews look like? Right? Many people mistakenly think that national origin discrimination against Jews means an entity says, I will not hire any Israelis. That's one form of national origin discrimination against Jews. But national origin discrimination against Jews is also what I was describing earlier. When you demand that Jews shed their ethnic pride, that you say you cannot support, right, this idea of a Jewish homeland, you can't express pride in the actions or activities or the existence of the state of Israel and of a Jewish homeland. You say, right, you're demanding that Jews disavow the right of Jewish self-determination. That's what national origin discrimination against Jews looks like. Demanding that Jews shed that part of their identity as Jews. That is national origin. That's targeting Jews on the basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity. And that's what you can see from the IHRA definition. The IHRA definition is describing what it is so that people understand what anti-Semitism today looks like.
Thank you for that thorough explanation. And also, what has been the impact of Title VI cases at San Francisco State, UCLA, and other campuses? And also, how does that inform your work on other cases moving forward, like at Illinois?
So it's a great question. So at San Francisco State, that was one of the first, that case was resolved with a settlement agreement. And one part of that settlement agreement required San Francisco State to issue a statement saying that they understood that Zionism is an important part of the identity of many of the Jewish students on campus. That's key. And that's something that has been repeated. We now, as you mentioned, have the Brandeis Center is responsible for a complaint that was an investigation that's been opened now by the Department of Education involving the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And one of the first steps that the university took to really start to try and address the anti-Semitism on campus there was they issued a joint statement, and part of that joint statement included a recognition that Zionism is an integral part of the identity of many of the Jewish students on their campus. In addition, the university is committed to putting together a task force to try and work on next steps and how to address incidents that happen on campus. And just recently, last week, when they had on campus the incident where there was a balcony, a student had on his balcony an Israeli flag, and there were between 15 to 20 raw eggs that were thrown at the balcony with the Israeli flag, the university issued a strong statement condemning that as anti-Semitic and linked again to this joint statement, which talked about how they understand that Zionism is an integral part of the identity of many of the Jewish students on their campus. The executive order also, you could see its impact with the resolution agreement that OCR, the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education, reached with NYU. In that settlement agreement, that resolution agreement, they required NYU to incorporate the IRA definition into the university's own anti-discrimination policies on campus, and then to provide training to the university community so that they would understand, right, as we just talked about, what is contemporary anti-Semitism? What does it look like? How does it manifest on campus? So that then you can begin to, as a community, address it.
Now, that case at NYU was wonderful. We actually had, we just released a guide to protect Jewish students recently, and we're going to be doing a webinar on it next week. But we actually had, on our commercial for it, we had Adela talk about her experience in fighting the good fight at NYU and kind of her experience in the year or so afterward in negotiating the settlement and working with your team and other organizations to make sure that, Jewish students are actually protected at NYU, and that, people who act in bad faith and violate the terms of the executive order are held accountable.
Yes, Adela is extraordinary. And her case at NYU really demonstrates how, one of the things that's important to note and to remember is that the IRA definition alone, and this is important for people to understand, to respond to those who are trying to pose the definition. The IRA definition alone does not make anything unlawful or punishable, right? There's in fact, the IRA definition itself says that it's a non-legally binding definition. The point of adopting the IRA definition, when we talk about adopting the IRA definition, is that it needs to be used as first and foremost as an educational tool, but it needs to be used so that people can understand what anti-Semitism is. Right? That is what it does. So if you adopt IRA, individuals are still free to say everything that is listed as one of the examples of anti-Semitism, right? In the United States, the First Amendment protects even hate speech. So all of those, if we're talking about just speech, is protected speech. But what's not protected, or what the First Amendment doesn't protect you against, is if you engage in and you say anti-Semitic things, you're not protected from being called an anti-Semite, right? Just like if you can say racist things that are protected by the First Amendment, but that won't protect you from being called a racist, right? The people who are opposing the IRA definition want to be able to continue to engage in anti-Jewish, comments in Jew hatred without being called anti-Semites. And what this does is it labels as anti-Semitic what is anti-Semitic. The punishment would only be for conduct that crosses the line and that universities have already determined violates university policies, right? And so, in other words, if you were trying to determine whether conduct is motivated by anti-Semitism, if there's anti-Semitic intent, then you could look to the definition to understand what anti-Semitism is. But criticism of Israel, especially criticism of Israel that's similar, as the definition itself says, it's similar to that levied against any other country, that's not anti-Semitism. Denying the right of Jewish self-determination, demanding that somebody shed this part of their Jewish identity, that's anti-Semitic. And if you're going to exclude somebody on that basis, then you're now already talking about conduct. In fact, I know Alums for Campus Fairness, a good example is what happened now at Johns Hopkins, which I think is really important. The Alums for Campus Fairness, I know, is very active in reaching out to Johns Hopkins to raise awareness and criticize the tweets of this TA who basically put out there a poll, essentially asking, her followers, well, should I fail the Zionists, right? And in addition to putting out this poll and spreading a blood libel about Jews by suggesting that they're responsible for ethnic cleansing, what she was really doing was inciting her followers to target Zionists, right? She wasn't just saying, I don't like Zionists. I think Zionists are wicked. I think Zionists deserve to fail. Instead, she was going beyond that. She was inciting a community of students, presumably, to turn against these students, this group of students. That's inappropriate conduct for a TA. And the truth of the matter is, she should, if she hasn't already been, she should be removed from her TA responsibilities because that is inappropriate conduct for a TA. She may have the right to express her own personal opinions, but what she did was not just speech. What she did was rile up a community to turn against the Zionists and believe that they should be treated in a discriminatory fashion, that they should be failed for no reason other, right, than their identity. Or even if you don't understand Zionism as part of identity and you view it as a viewpoint, she's saying they should be targeted and discriminated against on the basis of their viewpoint, which is also inappropriate for a TA to be doing. So I commend Alums for Campus Fairness for speaking out on that, but it's important to realize that what we're talking about there is not just speech. It was actually conduct already that she engaged in.
And thankfully, she kind of laid out her own case against herself publicly on the interweb. So it made our cases even stronger and easier. So that was, the positive end of there. I have a crowd question from a member of our Claremont Colleges chapter, Jeffrey Sheff, and he is asking, when should legal advice be sought for after a campus incident? Immediately, so the administration will take it seriously as a last resort, or somewhere in between? In which case, when?
So it's a really good question. I'm really glad you asked. And the truth of the matter is, the earlier you can reach out for legal guidance, the better. Because many people don't realize that when you ask for legal guidance, there are many, many steps between an incident happening and a formal Title VI complaint or a lawsuit. And the hope, honestly, is that if you think about things legally and you understand your legal rights, that maybe you might be able to successfully address the situation and improve the climate on campus without having to get to a formal Title VI complaint or a lawsuit. So the truth is, one of the things that the Brandeis Center has done is we created a program called our Jigsaw Fellows. Jigsaw stands for our Justice Initiative Guiding Student Activists Worldwide. What we've done is we have a select group of law school students who we have trained. We have taught them the areas of the law you really need to understand in order to effectively combat the anti-Semitism on campus. So they've learned about the anti-discrimination laws, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, First Amendment issues, principles of academic freedom, all of these issues. And the idea is that they are then available to work with undergraduates who are confronting and experiencing anti-Semitism on campus. Because we've realized that oftentimes students feel intimidated to talk to lawyers. And they worry, right? They think that if they're going to talk to a lawyer, somehow they're going to end up as a plaintiff in a lawsuit. And that's not the case. But it's very helpful to students for them to be able to articulate what's happening to them in a way that the university recognizes that what they're talking about is harassment and discrimination. Because the beauty of the law is that oftentimes the law can motivate entities and individuals to take steps that they might not otherwise be inclined to take because they feel they have to stay on the right side of the law, right? They want to avoid legal liability. So when the students articulate what's happening as a potential violation of Title VI, when they explain to university administrators how what's happening is pushing them out, right? Another example, I spoke to a student on one campus. This is pre-COVID. The campus had a tradition of once a week, they would have out on the big square, all the clubs and student organizations would come out and they'd table. So people would become aware of what student organizations were out there so that they could join, they could get involved. And this student was tabling for the ZOA, for the Zionist Organization of America, and Students for Justice in Palestine took a picture of her, put it up on social media. They covered her face with a little emoji, but she said it was still, people could still tell who it was. And they posted with this image, you know, Zionism is essentially the same as white supremacy. Why is she even permitted to table during, you know, what was this regular event on campus each week? And while she said she wanted to go show the administration that this made her feel unsafe because her picture was now on social media, even if her face was blacked out, I said to her, what you also have to explain to them is, what's the message here? The message here is that I, as a Jew, as a Zionist, am not welcome in what's the public forum, right? The public square where everybody else is allowed to share whatever their club stands for and whatever they represent. The only group that you're saying should not be afforded that same opportunity are the Jewish Zionists. That's the unlawful discrimination, because now you're trying to exclude and cut me out. And that's what we see happening on the campuses. So what the Jigsaw Fellows do is they work with the students to help them articulate so that the university realizes, and the little bell goes off and they say, oh my goodness, we have to protect this group. We have to make sure that they're welcome on campus, that they're not being excluded, that they're not being pushed out. So the earlier you can reach out and contact groups like the Brandeis Center for legal strategic advice, the better. Because sometimes we can convince the university to act and you may never even have to file a complaint, but we can help you work on talking points. We can help you work on writing. If it's an article, if you need to file a complaint, we'll help you work on that. You know, sometimes it's letters to the university that we help students draft, but the earlier, the better when it comes to reaching out for some legal guidance and advice.
Thank you. Do you think, first off, we have another question from the crowd. Marcia Harris, she's a member of our Vassar College chapter, and she is also a strong partner with ours in the North Carolina community. And she is asking, do you think Title VI, as it pertains to protecting Zionism, Zionists, and Jewish students, may be interpreted differently by the new administration?
So I think that the understanding that the understanding that Title VI protects religious groups on the basis of shared ancestry and ethnicity, I expect that this administration will adopt that same understanding. Because as I said, this has basically been an understanding that both the Obama administration accepted for the past 10 years. It has been understood by the Department of Justice and Department of Education. How aggressively this Department of Education will apply the IRA definition to these cases and utilize that has yet to be seen. You know, I would think that this administration should apply it because the IRA definition is pretty much identical to the definition that the State Department first posted on its website in 2010 during the Obama administration. The State Department posted its own definition. So the Obama administration had adopted essentially the same definition. Today's State Department, just a couple of weeks ago, and the Biden administration expressed enthusiastic support for the IRA definition. Clearly, that is, the State Department looks outward. They look internationally. So we've yet to hear the Department of Education talk about using it domestically. But I am cautiously optimistic that this administration, when presented with some of the very disturbing situations that we see happening on campus, will recognize the need to apply Title VI this way.
And staying in line with the conversation about this administration, this is not a crowd question, this is a question by me. following the resignation of Alon Carr, the U.S. Special Envoy combating anti-Semitism, do you see this administration reappointing that position or focusing much energy in that wing of the State Department?
So, yes, I think that this administration will most definitely appoint a special envoy because they're now obligated to. Congress actually passed legislation that elevated the special envoy position and made it a formal ambassador position on the level of a regular United States ambassador. So now I believe that President Biden will appoint someone to that position. I don't know who he will appoint, but that person will carry with them now even a greater level of seniority and gravitas as an ambassador. And I hope that the next special envoy will be able to accomplish much like Alon Carr. I think Alon Carr was a terrific special envoy. He was very strong when it came to encouraging broad adoption of the IRA definition. Thanks to him, you ended up with representatives from Bahrain adopting it, an International Council of Imams adopted it, Albania became the first Arab country, Morocco endorsed it. It's really, truly remarkable to see the Arab countries and entities that started to adopt the IRA definition thanks to the work of Alon Carr and his office. And he also clearly made it very clear from his office that he views anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism, that it is clearly anti-Semitism. And he expressed that very forcefully. And I think that was very important. So we'll see what the next envoy does.
Yeah, it'll be interesting and exciting to see what comes next for the envoy in the State Department. We have another crowd question. It's from Hillel Cohen. He is an alum of Columbia College in Missouri, and he is asking, it's more of a broad, movement-oriented question. Is the anti-Semitism on campus centrally directed or financed in some way? And if you could give, a small deep dive into what that looks like for him.
A small deep dive.
I phrase it in that way specifically because it requires a deep dive, but we can have a whole webinar on this. But.
Exactly. It does require a deep dive. There are, so Students for Justice in Palestine, which is one of the groups that's responsible for a lot of the activity that takes place on campuses, is closely affiliated with a group called American Muslims for Palestine. American Muslims for Palestine has been reported, and this is the deep dive that you can do and go Googling and look, as having connections with entities that were part of the fundraising network in the United States for terror, that supported terror activities years ago in the past. There are, I know, organizations and researchers that are looking at exploring the different connections and the different sources of funding. It's troubling to think, but is not surprising to understand that these groups on campus have these kinds of roots in organizations that were connected to terror. When you look today, for instance, and I think it's kind of interesting if you just look at the Abrahamic Accords, right? So the Abrahamic Accords show that there are Arab countries that believe now that the way to peace and prosperity for the Palestinians and for Arabs in the region is not anti-normalization, it's just the opposite. It's not boycott Israel. It's engage with Israel. It's do business with Israel. It's exchange with Israel, right? So you now have in the UAE fruits and vegetables in the marketplace, proudly displaying on the tags Israeli flags that these fruits and vegetables are coming from Israel. You have the Jewish communities in these countries, in the Emirates, now joining together and creating a Jewish federation and a Jewish rabbinical court, a Jewish Beit Din for the first time in years. The irony is that in many ways, Jews feel safer wearing a kippah in public in the UAE or in Bahrain today than they do on the streets of Paris or elsewhere in Western Europe. And so what's interesting is that whereas there's this push there to normalize relations with Israel, who is it? Who are the groups that are still opposed to normalization with Israel? Who are the groups? Are those groups that are really looking for coexistence? Are those groups that are really looking for peace and prosperity? Or are those groups that are looking to destroy the one and only Jewish state? And so if you look at it, now what you have is who's on the side of the equation that's opposed, that still pushes for boycotts, that still pushes for BDS, that still pushes for anti-normalization. It's groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, right? It's the terror organizations, it's Iran. And the real question for the Palestinian Authority is, which side are you going to take? Are you going to align yourself with the groups that are pushing for the destruction of Israel? And then continue to promote BDS and anti-normalization? Or are you going to align yourself with the groups that have decided that the best way forward for everybody in the region is to normalize relations, to do business with Israel? And I think that it's not surprising that what you see on the campuses is the continuation of the push for BDS and for anti-normalization, because these are groups that are less aligned with the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and the Arab countries that want to normalize relations with Israel, and are more closely aligned with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran and the entities that really seek the end and the destruction of the one and only Jewish state. And that's something that I think people need to start to talk about more and emphasize more on campuses.
We have another question by Jeffrey from Claremont Colleges, and he's asking, where does specifically freedom of speech end and actionable speech start? So
that's also one of those questions that could use a deep dive. When speech is used to actually marginalize and stigmatize and ultimately exclude, when the goal is to push out and discriminate against and treat differently a group, that's when I would argue that it has crossed the line. So if you are actively looking to push somebody out on this basis. So for example, Rose Rich, we worked with Rose Rich, who was the former vice president of student government at USC. And she was clearly targeted on the basis of her Zionism and her Zionist identity. And the purpose, the goal there was to deny her the right. She had been fairly elected to this position, was to deny her that opportunity purely because of her identity as a Zionist Jew. And that's where the speech ends up. Once you do that with the goal of excluding and pushing her out, it starts to cross the line into unlawful conduct.
Thank you for that clarification. And that was very quick and concise, because we could have had another webinar on that as well. Now, another question from Hello Cohen. He's asking, are there currently any open Title VI complaints against Columbia University? And I may add, are there currently any open Title VI complaints that you can discuss at any other campuses that you have not mentioned?
So I know that there had been complaints filed against Columbia University. I do not know whether the Office of Civil Rights actually formally opened up investigations. What happens is initially, before the investigations are formally opened, the Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights does kind of a pre-investigation. Those investigations sometimes can take many, many months, particularly if the complaints are long and complex, because the Office of Civil Rights goes through each and every one of those complaints. They are analyzing whether they are complaints that they can continue to investigate, whether they really are speech and not conduct, whether they're outside the statute of limitations or not. There are all sorts of things that go into their analysis. Oftentimes there are complaints that are filed. If they're not publicized, you have no idea that the complaints have been filed. And so there could be complaints that have been filed, and there could be cases that have been opened. And unless the complainants have decided to publicize them, we wouldn't even know that they had been opened. So I don't know the answer, quite frankly, to all of it. There used to be, I think, a website where you could try and do a search and figure out whether complaints had been opened against certain universities on the basis of whether it was race or national origin discrimination or these, but it doesn't give much detail when they open the investigation there. I don't, as I say, we talked about University of Illinois. The only one other school that I would mention, not in connection with OCR, but just because I think it's worth mentioning, and I had brought a little show and tell here because I think it's an important piece, again, for your alumni, and I think you have a lot of alumni from Tufts as well. So the Deadly Exchange campaign, and I know we have just a few more minutes, so that's the one campus that I would maybe talk a little bit about, the Deadly Exchange campaign at Tufts. The Deadly Exchange campaign at Tufts, I think, is an example of the campaigns that we've seen across the country to marginalize, stigmatize, and exclude Jews who support Israel. And what they're trying to do is push these students out of the racial justice movement, make them unacceptable, and make their voice, which includes obviously support for Israel, beyond the pale, right? To try and silence them and push them out. So one of the things that we saw with the Deadly Exchange campaign at Tufts is here was a campaign, presumably was a campaign that was meant to discuss police brutality and racism in America. But of course, those who may not be familiar with the Deadly Exchange campaign says is that police in the United States, law enforcement in the United States, learned their racism, learned their brutal methods, where? From Jews and particularly Israelis. And what they've done is they've targeted these law enforcement leadership exchange programs where American law enforcement representatives, both from local municipalities as well as university police, have gone on these trips to Israel where they end up meeting with Israeli police, Palestinian police. They travel the country. They have various sessions. The Students for Justice in Palestine has referred to these as military training sessions, which they are not. They're more akin to a birthright for police officers. And so what happens is they tried at Tufts to, they put a series of referendum questions out there last semester on the ballot and got a referendum passed, which demanded that the university apologize for 4 years ago having sent the head of police on one of these programs, and demanded that Tufts never again send anybody else on one of these trips and never hire anybody who had ever been on one of these trips. The interesting thing is, though, the booklet that they put together included this map. Let's see if I can get this clearly here. Now, what does this map have anything whatsoever to do with police brutality and racism in America? The only reason it's in their booklet is because one of the prerequisites for any student who wants to support racial justice at Tufts and who believes that they want to try and combat police brutality or racism in America, a prerequisite is accepting that Israel has no right to exist and that 1948 Israel, if you note on this map, is considered occupied territory and all of Israel doesn't exist. Instead, it's a state of Palestine. So that's what students today on campus are being told, like at Tufts. They're being told, if you want to be involved in the racial, social justice movement on our campus, if you want to fight police brutality, if you want to support Black Lives Matter, the first thing you have to do is shed your sense of Jewish peoplehood, disavow your connection to the Jewish homeland, and agree that the Jewish state of Israel has no right to exist.
Very powerful, and thank you for illuminating on the situation at Tufts. That's one of our most active chapters. It's relatively new in the grand scheme of our work, but they do great work there, and it's great to see that they have so much community support as well. I want to end it on a good note. First off, I want to say thank you so much, Alyza, for joining us. Our members have learned a lot from you, and we look forward to continuing to work with you in the future. And I just have one last question for you, and then you could do a quick little plug. And I would like to ask, what is your advice for alumni who want to help fight anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism at their alma maters?
So first off, stay connected to Alums for Campus Fairness. I think your organization is terrific. And what you do is you manage to coordinate and give strength in numbers and empower the alumni, because there's no doubt there are only a few real buttons, pressure points that universities will listen to. And one of them is their alumni. And so the most important things I would say is for alumni to remain educated. We have at the Brandeis Center a monthly newsletter. You can sign up on our website. Our website's www.brandeiscenter.com. You can sign up for our monthly Brandeis brief, where we have all sorts of materials that we send out. If you know students who are experiencing anti-Semitism, please have them reach out to us. You can reach us at info@brandeiscenter.com. But stay educated and remain involved, right? When you hear and see and become aware of things that are happening on the campus that you are alums from, don't hesitate to be heard and to reach out to your universities. Thank you. The students who are on those campuses, thank you too.
Exactly. Thank you to all the students. And as alumni, we're always here to support. As legal educators, advocators, and representatives, Alyza and her organization are always there to support you as well. And thank you, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.